Most of us spend our lives chasing the elusive goal of 8 consecutive hours of unbroken sleep. We track our cycles, silence our phones, and panic when we wake up at 3 in the morning. But if you were a human living 500 years ago, waking up in the middle of the night wouldn't be a sign of insomnia, it would just be a Tuesday. For the vast majority of human history, we didn't sleep like we do today. We slept in two distinct chunks. This phenomenon is known as biphasic sleep. It was the standard operating procedure for our ancestors for thousands of years. The night was divided into two segments, first sleep and second sleep. You would go to bed shortly after dusk. You'd sleep for about 4 hours. Then you would wake up. You'd be awake for an hour or two. You might pray, read by candlelight, talk to your spouse, or even visit a neighbor. Then you would return to bed for a second sleep that lasted until sunrise. This wasn't some niche behavior of a few isolated tribes. It was woven into the very fabric of human language and culture. In the 1990s, the historian Roger Ekirch spent 16 years poring over historical records. He found over 500 references to first and second sleep in letters, court documents, diaries, and medical books spanning centuries. In his 2005 book, At Day's Close, Ekirch highlights a 16th century medical manual from France. It advises that the best time to study, conceive children, or settle disputes was during the hour of the wakeful period between sleeps. Even Homer's Odyssey mentions this rhythm. But how do we know it was biological and not just a lifestyle choice? In the early 1990s, psychiatrist Thomas Ware conducted a landmark experiment at the National Institute of Mental Health. He took a group of volunteers and deprived them of artificial light. He placed them in a room where they were kept in darkness for 14 hours a day, mimicking the long nights of winter. For the first few weeks, the subjects slept for extended periods to catch up on their sleep debt. But eventually, their bodies settled into a natural rhythm. They slept for 4 hours, woke up for a 2 hour period of quiet wakefulness, and then slept for another 4 hours. During that 2 hour gap, their brains showed a surge in prolactin, a hormone that promotes relaxation and a feeling of peace. It was a time of meditative calm. They weren't tossing and turning in frustration. They were physiologically programmed to be awake. So, what happened to us? Why do we now view that midnight wake up as a disorder? The answer is twofold: the Industrial Revolution and the invention of the light bulb. Before the mid 17th century, the sun dictated our lives. When the sun went down, work stopped. You couldn't be productive in the dark, so you might as well sleep. But as cities began to grow, the demand for productivity soared. Artificial lighting, first oil lamps, then gas light, and finally electricity, began to push the night back. As light conquered the dark, the second sleep began to be squeezed out of existence. By the 19th century, the cultural expectation of a long, consolidated night of sleep had taken root. Parents began training their children to sleep through the night, a practice that would have been considered alien in the medieval period. The medical establishment eventually labeled the natural wakeful period as middle of the night insomnia. We started viewing a biological remnant of our past as a modern pathology. We became obsessed with getting 8 hours, despite the fact that our ancestors were doing just fine with 2 4s. This shift has had profound consequences. We live in an era of epidemic sleep anxiety. When you wake up at 3 in the morning today, your brain immediately floods with stress hormones. You worry about your job, your bills, and your health. You lay there, staring at the ceiling, thinking that if you don't fall back asleep immediately, you will be a wreck the next day. That anxiety is exactly what keeps you awake. Our ancestors didn't have that stress because they didn't have the expectation of unbroken sleep. The wakeful period was a time of productivity, intimacy, or reflection. It was a quiet, sanctioned part of the human experience. Looking back, we see that the 8 hour block is a relatively new invention. It's a byproduct of the modern industrial machine. We've traded our natural rhythms for the convenience of a 24-hour society, and we are paying the price in cortisol and caffeine. Understanding this history doesn't mean you should force yourself to wake up at midnight. Your internal clock or circadian rhythm has likely adapted to the modern world, but there is a lesson in the science of biphasic sleep. It suggests that our current definition of normal is narrow and fragile. The next time you find yourself wide awake at 3 in the morning, remember that you aren't broken. You are just falling into a rhythm that sustained your ancestors for millennia. You are participating in a quiet, dark ritual that has been practiced by nearly every human who ever lived. Maybe the problem isn't that we are waking up. Maybe the problem is the modern world's insistence that we are supposed to be like machines, running without pause, instead of living like the biological creatures we actually are. As we continue to optimize every aspect of our lives, from our diet to our fitness, perhaps the most radical thing we can do is give ourselves permission to be human. We spend so much energy fighting the dark, but there is a strange, ancient comfort in knowing that for the vast majority of our history, the night was never meant to be empty. It was meant to be lived.